Before we begin, if you find yourself wandering the sleepless corridors of night often, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions, where the tales are as endless as the hours you spend staring at the ceiling. Tonight's offering is a particularly restless one, a story that will make you grateful for modern medicine, or at least for counting sheep. Chapter 1. The Sleepless Nobleman. Lord Alaric of Blackmore had not slept in 7 nights. This was not for lack of trying. He had tossed in his 4-poster bed until the feathers in his mattress surrendered, forming resentful lumps beneath him. He had drunk warm milk until his stomach rebelled. He had even allowed the court minstrel to sing lullabies, though the man's voice could curdle cream. Nothing worked. The nobleman's eyes remained as wide and unyielding as the castle portcullis, and his temper had grown as sharp as the spikes atop its gates. On the 8th night, in a fit of desperation, Alaric summoned his steward, a wiry man named Godfrey, whose own ability to sleep through earthquakes was a source of both envy and irritation. "Fin me surgeon," Alaric demanded, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. Not one of those barber surgeons who bleeds peasants for a penny. A proper medieval surgeon. Someone with unconventional methods. Godfrey, who had long since learned not to question his lord's whims, bowed and set off into the moonlit village. By dawn, he returned with a figure who looked as though he had been conjured from the nightmares of a particularly superstitious monk. The surgeon's name was Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood, and he wore a cloak stitched from what appeared to be discarded leeching bowls. His beard was a tangled nest of gray, and his fingers, long, spidery things, twitched as though already imagining the incisions they might make. "You seek sleep," Leechwood declared, his voice like a rusty hinge. "A common ailment, yet one that requires uncommon remedies." Alaric, too exhausted to be wary, nodded eagerly. "Whatever it takes, gold is no object." Leechwood's eyes gleamed. "Excellent. Let us begin with the humors. Your sleeplessness is clearly an excess of black bile. A minor bloodletting will set you right." Before Alaric could protest, the surgeon produced a knife and a porcelain bowl with unsettling speed. The nobleman yelped as the blade nicked his arm, and dark blood dripped into the bowl. "There," Leechwood said, stirring the blood with a finger. "No, while your humors rebalance, we shall administer a sleeping draught of my own invention." From a pouch at his belt, the surgeon withdrew a vial of murky liquid that smelled like a cellar after a flood. "This," he announced, "is a tincture of poppy, henbane, and fermented turnip, guaranteed to bring sleep or your money back." Alaric hesitated. The concoction looked like something one might find at the bottom of a moat, but the weight of sleeplessness pressed upon him like a suit of armor, and he downed the vial in one gulp. The taste was indescribable, a foul marriage of bitterness and rot, and his stomach lurched in protest. "No," Leechwood said, clapping his hands. "We must ensure the draught takes full effect." "Lie back, my lord." Alaric obeyed, sinking into the pillows. For a moment, he felt a strange lightness, as though his bones had turned to smoke. Then the room began to spin. The surgeon's face blurred, his smile stretching like melted wax. The last thing Alaric saw before darkness swallowed him was Leechwood reaching into his cloak, withdrawing a set of brass tongs and murmuring, "Just a quick adjustment to the nasal passages. Promotes airflow." When Alaric awoke, 3 days later, he found himself strapped to his bed with bandages wrapped tightly around his head. His nose felt as though it had been used as a battering ram, and his tongue was coated in a substance that tasted suspiciously like mold. Godfrey stood at the foot of the bed, holding a ledger and looking vaguely apologetic. "The surgeon left an invoice, my lord. It appears he also treated you for excessive cranial vapors and restless toe syndrome." Alaric groaned, the whether from pain or the realization that he had willingly invited a medieval surgeon into his chambers. He could not say. As he stared at the ceiling, now more familiar to him than his own reflection, he vowed never again to seek help from a man whose tools included tongs, leeches, and fermented turnip. Outside the birds sang, the sun rose, and somewhere in the village Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood counted his coins, already devising new remedies for the sleepless and the desperate. Chapter 2. The Surgeon's Grim Workshop. Lord Alaric's recovery from the surgeon's ministrations was slow, and punctuated by a persistent ringing in his ears, which he suspected was either the lingering effect of the sleeping draught or the distant screams of past patients. Still, sleep had come briefly, violently, and with the subtlety of a war-hammer, and for that he found himself reluctantly grateful. Curiosity, however, was a more insidious affliction than sleeplessness. A week after his ordeal, Alaric found himself standing outside the crooked door of Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood's workshop, a ramshackle building wedged between the butcher's stall and a tannery whose odors alone could strip paint. The surgeon had invited him for a follow-up examination, though Alaric suspected the man simply wanted to showcase his collection of unsettling instruments. The door creaked open before he could knock, revealing Leechwood's grinning face, illuminated by the flickering light of a candle jammed into a human skull. "Ah, my lord, I see you've recovered enough to appreciate the artistry of my craft. Do come in." The workshop was a shrine to the grotesque. The walls were lined with shelves bearing jars of murky liquids, each containing floating specimens that ranged from suspiciously kidney-shaped to outright blasphemous. A cluster of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, their brittle leaves brushing against Alaric's forehead like the fingers of a curious ghost. The centerpiece of the room was a wooden table, its surface stained a dark, glossy brown that could have been polish or old blood. Leechwood swept a hand toward his collection. "Every tool has its purpose, my lord. Observe." He plucked a pair of rusted forceps from a hook. "These are for removing stubborn teeth, or, in a pinch, stubborn warts." He tapped a long needle-like instrument against his palm. The humor probe, essential for locating excess bile in the cranial cavity, and this, he lifted a mallet with a disturbingly well-worn handle. The persuader. For when a patient resists treatment. Alaric swallowed. Fascinating, but I was rather hoping for something less invasive this time. Perhaps a simpler remedy. The surgeon's smile widened. "Of course. Prevention is the hallmark of a wise patient. Allow me to show you my latest creation." He rummaged through a chest before producing a small glass orb filled with a sluggish green vapor. "The Ever-Rest orb. Breathe deeply, and your slumber will be as untroubled as a saint's." Alaric eyed the orb. The vapor inside pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of something that should not have one. "And what, precisely, is in it?" "Trade secrets, my lord. But I can assure you, the primary ingredient is distilled from a particularly soporific mold found only in the tombs of disgraced bishops, harmless if occasionally hallucinogenic." Before Alaric could protest, Leechwood uncorked the orb and thrust it under his nose. The scent was overpowering, a cloying mix of rotten fruit and damp crypt. His vision swam, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he was certain the walls were whispering. Then the surgeon yanked the orb away, corking it with a satisfied pop. "There. You should feel drowsy within the hour. If not, we can always revisit the persuader." Alaric staggered back, blinking away the last of the green fog. "I think I'll take my chances with the orb, thank you." Leechwood bowed. "Wiser choice, though should you require anything stronger, I've been working on a tonic brewed from the sweat of hibernating bears. Remarkably effective, if one ignores the side effects." Alaric made a mental note to never, under any circumstances, ask what those side effects might be. He backed toward the door, nodding politely as the surgeon continued listing his inventory, which now included a salve made from moon-touched snail and a set of ear candles guaranteed to expel malicious dreams. Outside, the cool evening air was a relief, though the smell of the tannery still lingered. Alaric took a deep breath trying to clear his lungs of the tomb mold vapor. As he walked back toward the castle, he realized with quiet horror that his eyelids were, in fact, growing heavy. Somewhere behind him, the workshop's candlelight flickered, casting long, grasping shadows onto the street. And inside, Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood hummed to himself, already planning his next masterpiece, a sleep aid involving eels, a copper helmet, and what he vaguely referred to as the lightning method. Alaric, meanwhile, resolved to never again step foot in that den of nightmares, at least not unless the insomnia returned. And given the way his head was beginning to buzz, he suspected it might. Chapter 3. The Theory of Humors. Lord Alaric had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that his visit to the surgeon's workshop would mark the end of his sleepless torment. For 2 nights, the Everest orb's foul vapor had indeed dragged him into a heavy, dreamless stupor. But on the 3rd night, the effects wore off with cruel abruptness, leaving him wide awake at midnight, staring at the canopy of his bed as if it held the secrets of the universe. By dawn, he was back at Leechwood's door, this time with dark circles beneath his eyes and a distinctly murderous glint in his gaze. The surgeon, however, seemed delighted by his return. "Ah, the orb's effects were temporary, I see. A common issue with first-time users. The body builds a resistance to Bishop's tomb mold surprisingly quickly." He ushered Alaric inside, where the smell of rust and something suspiciously like pickled eel hung thick in the air. Alaric slumped into a chair that creaked ominously beneath him. There must be another way. A less fungal solution. Leechwood stroked his tangled beard, nodding sagely. "What you require, my lord, is a fundamental rebalancing. Your insomnia is not a mere inconvenience. It is a revolt of the humors." He gestured grandly to a yellowed chart pinned to the wall, its corners nibbled by moths. The parchment depicted a man with his insides divided into 4 colorful regions, each labeled in spidery script: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. "Observe," the surgeon continued, tapping the chart with a bony finger. "Health is harmony. The ideal body is a perfect stew of these 4 fluids. Yours, I suspect, has become a broth of chaos." Alaric squinted at the diagram. "And how, exactly, does one fix a chaotic broth? By strategic removal, of course." Leechwood rummaged through a drawer and produced a brass bowl with unsettling stains. "Excess blood leads to restlessness. A quick bleeding will relieve the pressure." Alaric instinctively covered his forearm, where the surgeon's last incision still itched. "We've tried that. It didn't work." "Ah, but last time we targeted the arm. The humors are cunning. They retreat to other regions when threatened. Today we go straight to the source." Before Alaric could react, Leechwood pressed a cold, damp cloth to his forehead. "The temples, my lord, where the vapors gather." Alaric recoiled. "You're not cutting into my head." "Not cutting? No, not initially." The surgeon held up a slender hooked tool. "First, we encourage the excess humors to migrate downward. A few strategic leeches applied to the scalp will do wonders." The thought of slimy creatures fastened to his skull made Alaric's stomach lurch. "Absolutely not." Leechwood sighed, setting the leech jar aside with the air of a man deeply wronged by his patient's lack of vision. "Very well. If you insist on rejecting the wisdom of Galen himself, we must consider alternatives. Tell me, my lord, have your bowels been regular?" Alaric blinked. "What? Constipation is a notorious ally of black bile. A blocked gut leads to a restless mind." The surgeon's eyes gleamed as he lifted a bottle of murky liquid. "A purgative, then. 1 spoonful, and you'll sleep like a babe once the initial evacuation is complete." Alaric eyed the bottle. The sediment at its bottom swirled ominously. "What's in it?" "Mostly senna, and a hint of mercury for vitality." "Mercury?" Alaric's voice cracked. "The poison?" Leechwood waved a dismissive hand. Only in large doses. This is merely enough to stir the humors into motion. Think of it as a broom for the soul. Alaric stood abruptly, knocking over the chair. I think I'd rather remain sleepless. The surgeon's expression darkened. My lord, you must understand, the humors do not simply rebalance themselves. Left unchecked, your black bile will thicken. Your dreams will curdle into waking nightmares. You'll startle at shadows and weep at the sound of lute music. Is that the future you desire? Alaric hesitated. He had in fact wept at lute music just last evening, though he attributed it to exhaustion rather than cursed bodily fluids. Still, the idea of mercury sloshing through his veins was less than appealing. Leechwood saw his hesitation and pressed on. If you refuse the purgative, there is one final option. He reached into a cabinet and withdrew a small corked vial of iridescent blue liquid. A tincture of lunar dew and powdered sapphire. Rare, expensive. But it calms the bile without violence. Alaric eyed the vial. It was the first thing in the workshop that hadn't looked like it belonged in a torturer's toolkit. And this actually works. The surgeon placed a hand over his heart. On my honor, it has never once killed a patient. That, Alaric reflected, was probably the closest thing to a guarantee he would get. He uncorked the vial and sniffed. Surprisingly, it smelled like rainwater and mint. With a shrug and a silent prayer, he downed it in one gulp. The effect was immediate. A cool numbness spread from his throat to his fingertips, and the weight behind his eyes softened. The workshop's grim shadows no longer seemed threatening, merely interesting. Even Leechwood's face took on a pleasant, blurry quality. Ah, the surgeon murmured, watching him closely. The sapphire does its work. You should rest now, my lord, preferably before the drooling begins. Alaric barely heard him. The room tilted gently, like a boat rocking on a calm sea. His limbs felt heavy, his thoughts slow and syrupy. The last thing he remembered was Leechwood guiding him to a cot in the corner, where the scent of dried herbs and old blood mingled into something almost comforting. As darkness crept in, he distantly wondered whether the potion had truly rebalanced his humors or simply poisoned him into submission. But sleep, when it came, was deep and dreamless, and for the first time in weeks, Lord Alaric did not care which it was. Across the room, Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood corked the empty vial and tucked it away, making a mental note to dilute the next batch. The lunar dew was running low, and the last thing he needed was a nobleman asleep for 3 days. Again. Chapter 4. Leeches and Lullabies. The sapphire tincture had granted Lord Alaric a full night's sleep, an unprecedented victory, but by mid-morning his head felt stuffed with wool, and his limbs moved as if weighted with sand. When he arrived at Leechwood's workshop, swaying slightly, the surgeon clucked his tongue and steered him to the infamous blood-stained table with the air of a man who had expected this very outcome. The humors, Leechwood announced, are stubborn creatures. The tincture soothed them, yes, but like rebellious peasants, they require occasional reminders of their proper place. He lifted a glass jar from a shelf, its interior alive with squirming black shapes. Leeches, my lord, nature's most delicate regulators of bodily balance. Alaric eyed the jar with mounting dread. The creatures within coiled and uncoiled, their slick bodies glistening in the dim light. I told you last time, no leeches. The surgeon sighed, shaking the jar gently. And yet here you are, half-conscious, your humors clearly in disarray. Tell me, have you experienced strange tastes in your mouth? A metallic tang, perhaps? Alaric hesitated. He had, in fact, been spitting into his chamber pot all morning, convinced his saliva had turned to ink. Leechwood nodded sagely. Black bile, my lord. It thickens in the veins, creeping upward like a noxious fog. Left unchecked, it leads to madness, melancholy, and an unfortunate tendency to write bad poetry. He unscrewed the jar's lid with a wet pop. A few leeches applied to the temples will draw it out before it takes root in the brain. Before Alaric could protest further, the surgeon dipped a pair of tweezers into the jar and extracted a leech, its body undulating hungrily. The creature stretched toward Alaric's face as if sensing the warmth of his skin. "This," Leechwood murmured, "is Sevirudo melancholicus, the finest leech for cranial work. Observe its delicate grip." With practiced ease, he placed the leech just above Alaric's right eyebrow. The cold, gelatinous touch made Alaric shudder, but the worst was the sensation of tiny teeth pricking his skin, followed by the slow, rhythmic pulsing as the creature began to feed. "There," the surgeon said, selecting a second leech. "Symmetry is key." Another cold press, this time on the left temple. Alaric squeezed his eyes shut, trying to ignore the twin points of suction now fastened to his head. Leechwood hummed as he worked, a tuneless, meandering melody that might have been a lullaby or a dirge. The sound wove through the room, mingling with the occasional drip of water from the ceiling and the faint, wet noises of feeding leeches. "You're humming," Alaric gritted out. "A surgeon's trick," Leechwood replied, adjusting the position of a leech with meticulous care. "The vibration soothes both patient and practitioner. Also, it discourages the leeches from migrating toward the eyes. They're drawn to sound, you see, like tiny, blood-loving minstrels." Alaric decided then and there never to ask another question in this cursed workshop. He focused instead on the ceiling, where a spider industriously repaired its web. The leeches pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a grotesque rhythm that made his scalp crawl. After an eternity, or perhaps only 20 minutes, Leechwood plucked the engorged leeches free and held them up to the light. Their bodies, now swollen and dark, glistened like overripe grapes. "A productive session," he declared, dropping them into a waiting basin. "The black bile flows freely now. You should feel lighter, possibly dizzy." Alaric touched his temples where twin beads of blood welled. The room tilted slightly and his thoughts swam in sluggish circles. "Dizzy? Yes." The surgeon wiped his fingers on his already stained apron and rummaged through a drawer. "No, to prevent relapse, we must ensure the humors remain balanced. A poultice of crushed nightshade and badger fat, applied to the soles of the feet, will anchor the bile downward." Alaric groaned. "Must we?" Lakewood ignored him, stirring a foul-smelling paste in a mortar. "The feet, my lord, are the body's foundations. Treat them poorly, and the entire structure wobbles." He gestured for Alaric to remove his boots. With resignation, Alaric complied. The poultice, when applied, burned like hot coals, then settled into a persistent itch. He wiggled his toes experimentally, dislodging a clump of what he hoped was badger fat, and not something worse. "There," Leechwood said, wiping his hands. "You may sleep now, and when you wake you'll find your thoughts clearer, your spirits brighter, and your appetite for rich foods significantly diminished, a happy side effect of bile regulation." Alaric barely heard him. The combination of blood loss, leech venom, and whatever unholy ingredients lurked in the poultice dragged him downward into a drowsy haze. The surgeon's workshop blurred at the edges, the jars of preserved anomalies swimming in his vision like pickled constellations. Leechwood guided him to a threadbare cot in the corner, where the scent of mildew and old herbs clung to the bedding. As Alaric sank onto the thin mattress, the surgeon resumed his humming, the same eerie tune as before. It curled through the air, winding around Alaric's consciousness like a serpent coiling around prey. The last thing Alaric saw before sleep took him was the basin of spent leeches, their bloated bodies twitching faintly. One of them, perhaps sensing his gaze, raised its head as if to bid him good night. Then darkness, and for once, no dreams. In the workshop's dim light, Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood corked his jars and tidied his tools, pausing only to nudge the leech basin with his foot. "Rest well, my lord. he murmured to the sleeping nobleman. "Tomorrow, we discuss cupping." The leeches, sated and silent, seemed to shudder in agreement. Chapter 5. The Sleeping Draught. Lord Alaric awoke on the surgeon's cot with a mouth that tasted like rust and a head that felt stuffed with damp straw. The workshop was quiet, except for the occasional plink of water dripping into a basin, and the low, bubbling murmur of something thick simmering over a heart. Sunlight, thin and grudging, seeped through the grime-caked window, doing little to dispel the shadows clinging to the jars of preserved horrors lining the walls. Alaric sat up slowly, his temples throbbing where the leeches had feasted. His feet, still smeared with the remnants of the badger-fat poultice, stuck slightly to the floorboards as he stood. Across the room, Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood hunched over a cauldron, stirring its contents with a long, yellowed bone that might have once belonged to a very unfortunate chicken. "You're awake," Leechwood said without turning. "Good. The leech venom can sometimes induce a temporary paralysis in overly sensitive patients. I once treated a man who didn't blink for 3 days. Fascinating, really. His eyes eventually moistened themselves by raining like tiny personal thunderstorms." Alaric decided not to ask for clarification. He limped closer to the cauldron, where a viscous greenish-brown liquid burped ominously. The smell was an assault, a nose-wrinkling amalgamation of rotten eggs, burnt hair, and something earthy that hinted at a recent excavation. "What in God's name is that?" "The solution to your problem," Leechwood said, tapping the bone spoon against the rim of the cauldron. A glob of the concoction slopped over the side and hissed as it hit the flames. "A sleeping draught of unparalleled potency. It's taken me all morning to brew. The base is fermented barley, for gentleness, but the true power lies in the secondary ingredients." He gestured to a nearby table, where an array of dubious vials and dried plants lay scattered. Alaric squinted at the nearest ingredient, a shriveled, black root that looked like it had been pulled from a grave. "Is that mandrake?" "Among other things," Leechwood said cheerfully. "A pinch of hemlock for its calming properties, a tincture of poppy to smooth the transition into slumber, and just a whisper of monkshood to ensure the dreams stay pleasantly distant." He paused. "Do not, under any circumstances, consume more than a thimbleful at a time. Monkshood is a fickle friend." Alaric stared into the cauldron, where the liquid had now taken on a faintly luminescent sheen, like the glow of mold on a long-dead log. "You expect me to drink this?" "Expect? No, desperately hope. Certainly." Leechwood ladled a portion of the brew into a clay cup and pushed it toward Alaric. The liquid sloshed, leaving a faintly iridescent residue on the sides of the vessel. "One sip, and you'll sleep like the dead. Without, you know, the permanence." Alaric hesitated. The last time he'd ingested one of the surgeon's potions, he'd woken up with his nose inexplicably stuffed with garlic and a vague memory of singing to a goat. But the alternative, another sleepless night, another dawn spent staring hollow-eyed at the ceiling, was somehow worse. He took the cup. The first sip was a revelation in the worst possible sense. The taste was indescribable, a symphony of wrongness that coated his tongue like warm tar. His throat tried to seal itself shut in protest, but Alaric forced it down, his eyes watering. Leechwood watched him expectantly. "Well?" Alaric gasped, shuddering. "It tastes like a swamp's revenge." "Ah, the hemlock. It does have a certain earthy pungency. But focus, do you feel it yet? The weight behind the eyes? The gentle pull of oblivion?" Alaric blinked. Now that the surgeon mentioned it, there was a peculiar heaviness settling into his limbs, a drowsy warmth creeping through his veins. The workshop's edges softened, the jars of preserved specimens blurring into a friendly, indistinct audience. Even the surgeon's face seemed less alarming, his beard now a cozy nest rather than a tangled briar patch. "I think it's working," Alaric murmured. His voice sounded distant, as if spoken through layers of wool. "Excellent," Leekwood said, guiding him back to the cot. "Lie down before the floor becomes necessary. The monkshood tends to liquefy the knees around the 7-minute mark." Alaric barely made it onto the cot before the full force of the draught overtook him. The room tilted gently, then dissolved entirely, replaced by a velvety darkness that swallowed him whole. He dreamed, but only in fragments. A flicker of candlelight, the scent of burning herbs, the distant, rhythmic scrape of the surgeon's bone spoon against the cauldron. Once he thought he heard Leekwood humming again, that same eerie lullaby, but it might have been the wind, or the leeches, singing softly in their jar. When he finally woke, it was to the sound of someone knocking, no, pounding, on the workshop door. Alaric groaned, his skull feeling like it had been stuffed with wet parchment. The remnants of the draught clung to his mouth, a lingering bitterness that made his teeth ache. Across the room, Leekwood was arguing with a red-faced man in a merchant's tunic. "I told you, the sleeping draught requires precision," the surgeon snapped. "You can't just guzzle it like ale and expect to wake up before midsummer." The merchant jabbed a finger at him. "My brother hasn't stirred in 2 days. You said it would last 6 hours, you miserable quack." Leekwood threw up his hands. "Did he drink the entire vial?" "Because the dosage is very clear." Alaric stopped listening. He sat up slowly, his body protesting every movement. On the table beside him, a fresh clay cup sat waiting, this one filled with a clear, innocuous-looking liquid. A note, written in the surgeon's jagged script, rested beside it. "Want for the headache. Probably. And it gives you. Wadi, Jiskigum, coffee in?" Alaric drank without hesitation. This time it tasted only of rainwater and faint regret. Somewhere beyond the workshop's walls, a bell tolled the hour. Somewhere inside, the cauldron bubbled on, patient and perpetual. And in the corner, unnoticed by either of them, the jar of leeches trembled slightly, as if laughing. Chapter 6. The Price of Rest. Lord Alaric had, against all odds, slept. Not the fragile, fleeting doze of previous nights, but a deep, abysmal slumber that left him groggy but undeniably rested. The surgeon's draught had worked, albeit with the side effect of making his tongue feel like it had been seared with a hot poker. And for the first time in weeks, the world did not seem like an endless parade of torments. This fragile peace lasted precisely until Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood slid a piece of parchment across the worktable. With the quiet finality of a headsman's axe, Alaric stared at the sum scrawled at the bottom. Then he stared again, convinced his eyes were still fogged from sleep. "This cannot be correct." Leechwood smiled, the expression of a man who had long since abandoned the pretense of subtlety. "Oh, it is, my lord. The leech therapy, the poultice, the Everest orb, the sapphire tincture, the sleeping draught, not to mention the complimentary headache tonic, which I provided out of professional courtesy." He tapped the parchment with a stained fingernail. "Medicine is not cheap, and mine is particularly specialized." Alaric's fingers twitched toward his coin purse, though he already knew it would not hold nearly enough. "You're charging me the equivalent of a warhorse for a few nights' sleep." The surgeon's smile sharpened. "No, my lord. I'm charging you for my expertise. The leeches alone were imported from the marshes of Lackmore, where they're cultivated by blind monks who sing to them nightly. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to transport leeches without them becoming agitated? One jostled crate, and you've got a carriage full of irritable bloodsuckers." He leaned in. "And let's not forget the hemlock, harvested under a new moon by gloved virgins, lest its potency wane. The markup on gloved virgins these days is criminal." Alaric pinched the bridge of his nose where the ghost of a headache was already reforming. "You expect me to believe any of that?" Leechwood shrugged. "Belief is optional. Payment is not. though if coin is truly an issue, we could consider alternative arrangements. His gaze flicked to Alaric's signet ring, then to the silver-chased dagger at his belt. The nobleman instinctively covered the dagger with his hand. Absolutely not. Pity. It would have made an excellent tonsil probe. The surgeon sighed and began ticking off items on his fingers. Very well. Let's discuss terms. You could pay half now, half in a fortnight. Though, should you default, I reserve the right to repossess the humoral balance I've restored. Painfully. He paused. Or if you prefer, you could offer a service in exchange. A nobleman's endorsement carries weight, and business has been slow since the incident with the blacksmith's wife. Alaric frowned. What incident? The less said, the better. Suffice it to say, not everyone appreciates the purgative properties of mercury. Lakewood waved a hand. But that's beside the point. A signed testimonial from you, displayed prominently in my workshop, would do wonders for my reputation. Lord Alaric of Blackmoor slept like the dead, thanks to Dr. Leechwood's miraculous draughts. Or words to that effect. The nobleman hesitated. The idea of lending his name to the surgeon's dubious enterprise rankled, but the alternative, either beggaring himself or risking a repossession of his humoral balance, whatever that entailed, was worse. Before he could answer, the workshop door burst open, revealing Godfrey, Alaric's beleaguered steward. The man's face was flushed, his thinning hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. My lord, he panted, the ducal envoy has arrived early. They're waiting in the great hall, and the duke's daughter is with them. Alaric went very still. Lady Seraphina. Godfrey nodded grimly. She asked after you twice already. Apparently, she's heard of your condition. A cold sweat prickled down Alaric's spine. Lady Seraphina's visits were rare but memorable, chiefly for her razor-sharp wit and her uncanny ability to detect weakness at 40 paces. The thought of facing her while looking like a man who'd been repeatedly bled by an over-enthusiastic barber was unbearable. Leechwood, sensing an opportunity, cleared his throat. It seems, my lord, that you require not just rest, but the appearance of vitality. Fortunately, I have just the thing. He reached into a cabinet and withdrew a small vial of ruby-red liquid. The elixir of vigor. One sip and your eyes will sparkle, your step will lighten, and your pallor will improve dramatically. Side effects may include temporary euphoria and an increased urge to compose sonnets, but that's hardly a drawback in courtly circles. Alaric eyed the vial. And how much does this one cost? The surgeon's grin was all teeth. Let's call it part of the package, provided, of course, that my name appears in your testimonial. In gold ink. Outside, a bell tolled, marking the hour. The ducal envoy would not wait much longer. Alaric snatched the vial and downed it in one gulp. The effect was immediate. Heat flooded his veins, his fatigue sloughing away like old skin. His vision sharpened, the workshop's grim details suddenly crisp and vivid. Even his reflection in a nearby jar of preserved newts looked marginally less like a man who'd been exhumed. Leechwood clapped his hands. Marvelous. Now, about that testimonial. Later, Alaric said, already striding toward the door. Assuming I survive the next hour. The surgeon's chuckle followed him into the street. Oh, you'll survive, my lord. The bill, however, is eternal. As Alaric hurried toward the castle, the elixir thrumming in his blood, he realized two things. First, he did, in fact, have an overwhelming urge to compose a sonnet. And second, he would never sleep soundly again, not with the weight of Leechwood's invoice hanging over him. Somewhere behind him, in the dim recesses of the workshop, the leeches stirred in their jar, dreaming of gold. Chapter 7. The Nobleman's Doubts. The elixir of vigor had carried Lord Alaric through his encounter with Lady Seraphina with surprising dignity. He had managed a coherent conversation, even a passable jest about the weather, and when she arched one fine eyebrow at the faint leech marks still visible at his temples, he had laughed it off as the result of an overzealous barber. But now, Back in the privacy of his chambers, the potion's effects were fading, and with them, his fleeting sense of triumph. A peculiar heaviness had settled in his limbs, and his breath tasted inexplicably of copper and damp earth. Worse, the scent of the draught lingered in his nostrils, a cloying, fungal reek that no amount of wine could wash away. Alaric paced before the cold hearth, the events of the past week unraveling in his mind like a poorly stitched wound. The leeches, the poultices, the draughts that smelled like something scraped from the underside of a tomb. He had been so desperate for sleep that he had not questioned any of it. But now, doubts crept in, whispering that perhaps Dr. Thaddeus Leekwood's methods were less medicine and more elaborate theater. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Godfrey entered bearing a tray of bread and cheese, his expression carefully neutral. "You sent for refreshment, my lord." Alaric waved him in. "Tell me, Godfrey, honestly, do I look different to you?" The steward set the tray down with deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning Alaric's face. "You look rested, my lord, though there is a certain greenish tinge about the lips." Alaric touched his mouth, alarmed. "Green?" "A very pale green," Godfrey amended. "Like young willow leaves, or perhaps old cheese." "Wonderful," Alaric muttered. He seized a piece of the actual cheese from the tray and sniffed it, half expecting it to smell healthier than he did. Godfrey hesitated, then added, "If I may speak freely, my lord, the surgeon's reputation is complicated. The blacksmith's wife isn't the only one who's had a poor experience. There's the baker who lost 3 teeth to a strengthening tonic. The tailor who hallucinated spiders for a week after a calming elixir. And of course, the incident with the mayor's prized hunting dog." Alaric frowned. "What happened to the dog?" "It sang," Godfrey said flatly. "For 14 hours straight, in what the mayor swears was his late grandmother's voice." Alaric sank into a chair, the cheese forgotten in his hand. "And you didn't think to mention any of this before I let the man stick leeches to my head?" Godfrey had the grace to look abashed. "You seemed so hopeful, my lord. And to be fair, you have been sleeping." "A fair point. But at what cost?" Alaric pushed himself to his feet, resolve hardening. "Fetch my cloak. I'm paying the good doctor another visit." The surgeon's workshop was, if possible, even more unsettling by candlelight. Shadows pooled in the corners like spilled ink, and the specimens in their jars seemed to watch as Alaric strode in without knocking. Leechwood looked up from his cauldron, where he was stirring a viscous purple sludge. "Ah, my lord, come to settle your account, or perhaps for another dose of the elixir. I've been refining the formula. This batch has a hint of crushed pearls for luminosity." Alaric did not sit. "What exactly was in that sleeping draught you gave me?" The surgeon's stirring did not falter. "A proprietary blend, as I said. Fermented barley, hemlock, poppy, and the monk's hood," Alaric interrupted. "Which, unless I'm mistaken, is also called wolfsbane, and is deadly in doses larger than a whisper." Leekwood's smile was indulgent. "All medicine is poison in the wrong measure, my lord. Even water can kill if you drink enough of it." "That's not an answer." Alaric slammed his palm on the table, making the jars rattle. "I've heard the stories, Leechwood. The singing dog, the spiders, the blacksmith's wife. You're not a surgeon. You're a purveyor of barely controlled disasters." For the first time, the surgeon's facade slipped. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his fingers tightened around the stirring rod. "I see. You've been listening to small-minded fools who wouldn't know progress if it bit them on the arse." He set the rod aside with deliberate care. "Tell me, my lord, when you came to me, were you sleeping?" "No. You were desperate. And desperation requires bold measures. Yes, my methods are unconventional. Yes, there are risks. But you are sleeping now, aren't you? Alaric opened his mouth, then closed it. The man had a point. Leechwood pressed his advantage. What would you have preferred? A prayer and a pat on the head? A soothing cup of chamomile while you slowly lost your mind to exhaustion? He picked up a vial of something that shimmered ominously. Medicine isn't about comfort. It's about results. Alaric exhaled, some of the fight leaving him. Then why do I feel worse? Because healing isn't linear, the surgeon said, though his tone had lost some of its edge. The body rebels before it accepts change. The green tinge will fade. The taste in your mouth will pass. And if it doesn't, well, I have a tonic for that too. Alaric rubbed his temples. He wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but the weight of the last sleepless weeks pressed down on him, sapping his resolve. Perhaps Leechwood was right. Perhaps the cure was worse than the disease, but at least I was a cure. Silence settled over the workshop, broken only by the occasional bubble from the cauldron. Finally, Alaric sighed. Fine, no more monkshood. Leechwood's smile returned. Of course, my lord. I have a lovely alternative involving fermented figs and ground stag antler. Much gentler. He reached for a fresh vial. Shall we? Alaric eyed the offering, then the surgeon's expectant face. Somewhere in the room, a leech slithered against its jar. He took the vial. Some battles, it seemed, were not worth fighting. At least not while he still tasted copper. Chapter 8. The first sip. The vial was warm in Lord Alaric's hand, as if the liquid inside pulsed with a life of its own. He rolled it between his fingers, watching the thick, amber-colored potion coat the glass in sluggish waves. Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood watched him with the patient smile of a man who had seen this hesitation 1,000 times before, and who knew precisely when to intervene. Fermented figs, the surgeon murmured, nodding to the vial. And stag antler, as promised, a far gentler remedy than our previous attempts. His fingers twitched toward it, as if to helpfully guide it to Alaric's lips, but he restrained himself at the last moment. You'll find the taste quite distinctive. Distinctive. But Alaric had learned that Leechwood's definitions were flexible at best. The Everest orb had been distinctive. The hemlock draught had been earthy. The leeches, apparently, had been delicate. He unstoppered the vial and sniffed cautiously. The scent hit him like a physical blow, a cloying syrupy sweetness undercut by something deeply, irrevocably wrong. It was the smell of fruit left to rot in the sun, of meat forgotten at the back of a cellar, of something that had no business being consumed by anything living. His stomach lurched. Ah, Leechwood said brightly. That's the stag antler. It does develop a certain AIM character after a few months of fermentation. Alaric's jaw tightened. Months? A year, actually. But aged remedies are the most potent, my lord. Like fine wine. Wine doesn't smell like a carcass. The surgeon chuckled. Then you've never had yummy wine. Alaric hesitated. The potion was vile, but the alternative was another sleepless night, another dawn spent staring hollow-eyed at the ceiling, another day of Lady Seraphina's knowing glances, of Godfrey's poorly concealed pity. He raised the vial. The first sip was worse than he could have imagined. The taste was an abomination, a violation of the senses. The figs had long since surrendered any semblance of fruitiness, leaving behind only a sickly, fungal sweetness that clung to his tongue like tar. Beneath it, the stag antler announced itself with a bitter, musky punch, as if someone had distilled the essence of a damp hunting lodge and mixed it with spoiled honey. His throat convulsed, his body rebelling before his mind could even process the full horror of what he'd done. Leechwood, damn him, was watching with rapt fascination. Swallow, he urged. It doesn't work if you don't swallow. Alaric gagged but obeyed. The potion slithered down his throat, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. His eyes watered. His nose burned. Somewhere deep in his chest, something spasmed in protest. "There," the surgeon said, patting his shoulder as if he'd just accomplished something noble. "The worst is over." Alaric coughed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "That," he rasped, "is the single most revolting thing I have ever consumed." Leekwood beamed. "High praise. It means the ingredients are fresh." He took the empty vial and held it up to the light, examining the dregs. "Now we wait. The effects should begin within the hour. You may experience some lightheadedness, a tingling in the extremities, possibly a brief but vivid hallucination. Pay no mind to the latter. It's just the figs communicating with your humors." Alaric stared at him. "Communicating? Metaphorically, of course, unless you speak fey." The surgeon ushered him toward the door. "Best to retire to your chambers now, my lord. The transition to slumber can be abrupt." Alaric didn't argue. The room was already tilting gently, the jars of preserved specimens swaying in his vision, as if caught in an unseen current. His fingers tingled, then went numb. The taste of the potion lingered, but it was distant now, fading beneath a creeping wave of drowsiness. He stumbled into the street, the cool evening air doing little to clear his head. The cobblestones beneath his feet seemed to ripple like water. A passing merchant gave him a wide berth, his expression caught between concern and disgust. By the time Alaric reached his chambers, his legs had all but given up. He collapsed onto his bed, boots still on, and stared at the ceiling as it melted and reformed above him. The figs, it seemed, had a lot to say. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the shadow of a stag, great antlers branching like a forest, moving across the far wall. The last thing he thought as sleep dragged him under was that he should have stuck with the Leeches. Chapter 9. Visions and Delirium. The moment sleep took Lord Alaric, the nightmares began. At first, it was only shadows. Shapes moving at the edges of his vision, twisting like smoke. Then the whispers started, low and guttural, as if the air itself had learned to speak. The bed beneath him seemed to dissolve, the mattress giving way to something damp and yielding, like the belly of a great beast. Then the plague doctors arrived. They emerged from the darkness one by one, their beaked masks gleaming like polished bone. Their long black cloaks rustled as they circled his bed, their glass-eyed stares unblinking. One leaned close, the tip of its beak nearly brushing Alaric's cheek. He tried to recoil, but his body refused to obey, his limbs leaden and useless. "Interesting humors," the plague doctor mused, its voice muffled behind the mask. "Quite the imbalance. We should remove the excess." Another doctor nodded, producing a hooked blade from the folds of its robe. "Start with the liver. The liver is always greedy." Alaric tried to protest, but his mouth would not open. The blade descended, and the scene shattered like glass. Now he stood in a grand hall, its walls lined with skeletons. Not the clean, assembled kind found in physicians' studies, but ragged, half-rotted things, their jaws hanging open in silent laughter. At the center of the room, a group of them danced, their bony feet clattering against the stone floor in a macabre jig. A skeletal fiddler sawed at a violin made of ribs and sinew, the music a screeching, off-key wail. One of the dancers turned toward Alaric, its empty sockets alight with blue flame. "Join us," it rasped, extending a fleshless hand. "The dead sleep so much better than the living." Alaric stumbled back, his heart hammering. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The potion, Leekwood's damned potion, had to be the cause. But knowing that did nothing to stop the fear crawling up his spine. The hall melted again, reforming into the surgeon's workshop. But this version was distorted, the jars on the shelves pulsing like living things, their contents pressing against the glass, as if desperate to escape. Leechwood stood at his cauldron, stirring a bubbling black liquid with a human femur. He looked up as Alaric entered, his eyes two pits of absolute darkness. "Ah, my lord," he said, his voice echoing as though spoken from the bottom of a well. "I was just preparing your next dose. This one requires a fresh finger. Yours, preferably." Alaric backed away, but the door had vanished, replaced by a wall of writhing leeches. Their tiny mouths gaped hungrily. "You'll sleep eventually," Leechwood promised, advancing with the bone spoon. "One way or another." Alaric woke screaming. The bed was drenched in sweat, the morning light slicing through the window like a knife. His hands shook as he clutched the sheets, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The taste of the potion still lingered, but the horrors were gone, at least for now. Across the room, his reflection in the polished mirror stared back at him, pale and hollow-eyed. For the first time in weeks, Lord Alaric had slept, and he would rather die than do it again. Chapter 10. The Surgeon's Cheerful Diagnosis. The walk to Leechwood's workshop was a blur of trembling limbs and cold sweat. Lord Alaric's cloak clung to him like a second skin, damp with the remnants of his night terrors. He barely noticed the villagers who scurried out of his path, their faces a mix of concern and morbid curiosity. The nobleman looked less like a lord and more like a man who had fought a losing battle with a particularly vengeful ghost. When he threw open the workshop door, the surgeon was elbow-deep in what appeared to be a barrel of fermented eels. The stench hit Alaric like a physical blow, but it barely registered over the pounding in his skull. "Leechwood!" His voice came out raw, scraped thin from screaming. The surgeon turned, his face lighting up with delight. "Ah, my lord, I take it the potion worked." He wiped his hands on his already ruined apron, leaving silvery eel grease streaks across the fabric. Alaric stared at him. "Worked?" The word came out strangled. "I was carved open by plague doctors and invited to a skeleton ball." Leechwood clapped his hands together. "Marvelous, just as I predicted." "You predicted this?" "Of course." The surgeon rummaged through a pile of parchment before producing a stained notebook filled with cramped, feverish handwriting. "Here we are. Patient may experience vivid hallucinations of mortality personified. Indicates successful purging of excess vapors. A textbook reaction." Alaric gripped the edge of the worktable to keep from swaying. "I want a different textbook." Leechwood ignored him, flipping through more pages. "The intensity suggests deep-seated humoral corruption. We should follow up with a course of mercury steam baths, or perhaps a light trepanning to relieve cranial pressure." He tapped his temple thoughtfully. "Nothing opens the mind like a literal hole." Alaric's stomach lurched. No more holes. No more potions. No more anything. The surgeon sighed, setting aside his notes. "My lord, I understand your distress, but you must see the progress. You slept, didn't you? Through sheer exhaustion after being terrorized by my own mind. And yet you stand here, breathing, your humors undoubtedly more balanced than before." Leechwood leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The visions are a feature, not a flaw. The body cannot heal until it first confronts its own corruption. The plague, doctors, manifestations of your fear of death. The skeletons, a reminder that all men rot. By facing them, you've taken the first step toward true equilibrium." Alaric opened his mouth, then closed it. The explanation was absurd, but a traitorous part of him recognized the twisted logic. He had slept. Deeply. The kind of sleep that left a man feeling scraped raw, yes, but sleep nonetheless. Leechwood pressed a cup into his hands. The liquid inside was clear, innocuous. Mint and honey. For the nerves. No figs, no stag antler, I promise. Alaric sniffed it warily. It smelled like mint and honey. Against his better judgment, he took a sip. The sweetness was a balm after the lingering rot of the potion. The surgeon nodded approvingly. "Now, about payment for the treatment." Alaric set the cup down with a sharp click. Payment? Naturally, the fermented fig and stag antler potion contained extremely rare ingredients. The antler alone was sourced from a sacred white stag said to be blessed by Saint Hubert himself, or possibly cursed by a woodland witch. The provenance was unclear, but the cost was not. Alaric rubbed his temples. The mint drink had soothed his nausea, but a new headache was forming behind his eyes. How much? Leekwood smiled, the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment. Let us discuss barter. I've heard fascinating rumors about your family's collection of antiquities. The nobleman went very still. What antiquities? A certain chalice, perhaps, said to have been touched by the hand of a martyr. Or was it a murderer? Either way, the humoral properties would be extraordinary. Alaric stood abruptly. No. Then perhaps a simple testimonial will suffice. Lord Alaric slept like the dead after Dr. Leechwood's miraculous treatment. No refunds for exorcism-related damages. Outside, the church bells began to toll noon. The sound sent a fresh spike of pain through Alaric's skull. He needed air. He needed silence. He needed to never set foot in this cursed workshop again. He turned toward the door. Leechwood called after him, cheerful to the last. Remember, my lord, the humours never rest. I'll expect you at week's end for the mercury steam. Alaric didn't answer. He was already halfway down the street, walking as fast as his shaky legs could carry him. Behind him, the workshop door creaked shut, but not before he heard the distinct sound of a leech plopping happily into water. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the dry rattle of bones laughing. Chapter 11. The Nobleman's Escape. Lord Alaric did not return to his castle. He did not stop at the tavern for fortifying wine. He did not even pause to acknowledge the villagers who gawked at his disheveled appearance as he strode through the streets like a man fleeing the hangman's noose. Instead, he went straight to the stables. The stable boy took one look at his wild eyes and sweat-drenched tunic, and wordlessly led out his fastest horse. Alaric didn't bother with pleasantries. He swung himself into the saddle with the desperate energy of a man who had just escaped a dungeon, dug his heels into the horse's flanks, and rode as if the devil himself were snapping at his heels. The countryside blurred past in a haze of green and gold. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying away the last clinging traces of Leechwood's workshop, the scent of herbs and blood, the metallic tang of mercury, the faint, ever-present reek of something pickled and forgotten. With each mile, his breathing steadied. With each galloping stride, his grip on sanity tightened. By the time he reached the old hunting lodge at the edge of his lands, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the forest in long, trembling shadows. The lodge was small, draughty, and most importantly, far removed from any surgeons, their potions, or their leeches. Godfrey found him there 2 days later, sitting before a crackling fire with a tankard of ale and the hollow-eyed stare of a man who had seen too much. "My lord," the steward said carefully, stepping inside and brushing dust from his sleeves. "You've been missed." Alaric took a long drink before answering. "Tell me, Godfrey, have you ever considered the merits of sobriety?" The steward blinked. "I can't say I have. Neither had I. Until now." He set the tankard down with exaggerated care. "From this day forward I will embrace the sacred virtues of exhaustion. I will endure sleepless nights with dignity. I will count sheep until they revolt and form a union. I will do anything," his voice cracked slightly, "so long as it does not involve Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood." Godfrey hesitated and cleared his throat. "About that, my lord, the surgeon sent a message, along with an invoice." He produced a folded parchment from his coat, its edges singed as if it had been held too close to a flame. Alaric didn't touch it. "Burn it. There's also this." Godfrey held up a small glass vial filled with a familiar amber liquid. A scrap of parchment tied to it read, "When you change your mind." Isapento. Nimsandi didn't absicabete. Alaric stood abruptly, sending the tankard clattering to the floor. He snatched the vial and hurled it into the fire. The glass shattered, and the liquid within erupted in a burst of greenish flame, sending up a coil of smoke that twisted into the vague shape of a leech before dissipating. Godfrey coughed. "I'll take that as a refusal." "You'll take that as a declaration of war," Alaric corrected grimly. "If that man sets foot on my lands again, have the guards set the dogs on him, and not the mayor's singing hound, the euboric dogs." Back in the village, in his dim and cluttered workshop, Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood paused in the act of disemboweling a particularly large frog. He tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear, then smiled. "Patience," he told the leech jar. "They always come back." The leeches, as usual, said nothing. But deep in the forest, in a drafty hunting lodge, a nobleman shuddered as if someone had just walked over his grave. Outside, an owl hooted. Somewhere far away, a dog howled. And in the hearth, the last embers of the green flame winked out, leaving only ashes and a promise. Chapter 12. A Peasant's Wisdom. Lord Alaric lasted 3 nights at the hunting lodge before the sleeplessness returned with a vengeance. The first night, he told himself the crisp forest air would lull him into slumber. The second night, he drank until the room spun, only to find himself wide awake the moment his head hit the pillow. By the third night, he took to pacing the length of the creaky wooden floor like a caged beast, muttering curses under his breath with each turn. At dawn, bleary-eyed and brittle with exhaustion, he stumbled outside to find an old farmer tending to a patch of turnips near the edge of the lodge's overgrown garden. The man was hunched and weathered, his face a road map of wrinkles, but his movements were steady as he worked the soil. He glanced up as Alaric approached, squinting against the morning light. "Lord," he said, touching his brow in a gesture that was more acknowledgment than salute. "You look like Death's cousin." Alaric rubbed his temple where a persistent ache had taken root. "I haven't slept." The farmer nodded sagely, as if this were the most expected news in the world. "Aye. The mind races when it ought to rest." He straightened with a grunt, brushing dirt from his knees. "My wife used to say the night is no time for thinking. That's what the day is for." Alaric exhaled through his nose. "And what did your wife suggest for the nights when thinking insists on happening anyway?" The old man chuckled, revealing a gap where his front teeth had once been. "She told me to count sheep." Alaric stared at him. "Count sheep?" "Aye. Picture jumping over a fence, one after another. Simple as that." The nobleman opened his mouth, then closed it. He had, of course, heard of this remedy before. Some folk tale passed down through generations, a quaint notion for simple people with simple problems. He had humored the idea once years ago, back when his sleeplessness had been a mild inconvenience rather than a waking torment. It had done nothing. And yet here was a man who looked as though he had never spent a night, staring at the ceiling in his life. A man who probably slept the deep, untroubled sleep of the truly unbothered. A man whose biggest concern was turnips. Alaric pinched the bridge of his nose. "And this works?" The farmer shrugged. "Does for me. Course, sometimes the sheep get rowdy." Alaric frowned. "Rowdy? Argue about who goes next, form little cues. Once I swear one of 'em turned around and winked at me." He scratched his chin. "But mostly they just jump." For a long moment, Alaric simply stood there, weighing the sheer absurdity of the conversation against the even greater absurdity of his current predicament. A nobleman brought low by his own inability to close his eyes, taking advice from a man who negotiated with imaginary livestock. Desperate times. That night, sprawled once more in the lumpy bed of the lodge, Alaric squeezed his eyes shut and tried it. "Wanna sheeping," he thought, conjuring the image of a fluffy white creature trotting toward an obliging fence. "Bedtime needs help. Answer sheep. 3 sheep. Na, dan this lady. Need for the arte." By 12, the sheep had developed distinct personalities. The fifth one was a complainer, muttering about the height of the fence. The eighth kept stopping to nibble grass that wasn't there. The 12th had suspiciously human eyes. By 20, they were unionizing. Alaric groaned and threw an arm over his face. Outside, an owl hooted. The wind rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a fox yipped. And inside the lodge, a nobleman lay awake, contemplating the fact that even peasant wisdom had failed him, and at least the sheep hadn't sung. Yet. Chapter 13. The surgeon's next victim. Dr. Thaddeus Leechwood was in the middle of feeding his leeches a celebratory meal of diluted vinegar when the knock came at his door. The sound was timid, hesitant, the knock of someone who was not entirely sure they wanted an answer. He smiled, setting aside the jar of squirming black bodies, and adjusted his stained apron to better display its array of ominous stains. The woman who stood on his doorstep was young, though the dark circles beneath her eyes aged her prematurely. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her shawl, and when she spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper. "They say you can help with sleeplessness." Leechwood stepped aside with a flourish. "They say many things, my dear. Some of them even true. Come in." The workshop was, as always, a carefully curated nightmare. Jars of unidentifiable specimens lined the shelves, their contents floating in murky liquid. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, brushing against the woman's hair like skeletal fingers as she passed beneath them. The scent of blood, herbs, and something profoundly unsettling clung to the air. The woman, who introduced herself as Mistress Ellen, a weaver's widow, sat gingerly on the edge of the stool Leechwood offered her. "It's been weeks," she admitted. "I can't sleep more than an hour at a time. I hear noises in the walls." Leechwood nodded sympathetically, already reaching for a brass bowl. A classic case of humoral obstruction. The black bile thickens in the veins, whispering to the mind, even as the body begs for rest. He tapped the bowl with a fingernail. "A simple bleeding will set you right." Ellen hesitated. "I was hoping for something less sharp." The surgeon's grin widened. "Ah, a woman after my own heart. Very well. Let us begin with something gentler." He turned to a shelf and selected a small clay pot, its lid sealed with wax. A salve of poppy and honey applied to the temples, mild, soothing, and entirely painless. Ellen relaxed slightly. "That sounds much better." Leechwood handed her the pot, then paused. "There is, of course, the matter of payment." Her fingers tightened around the salve. "I don't have much coin." "Coin is dull," Leechwood said, waving a hand. "But I hear your late husband was a weaver of some skill. Tell me, did he ever work with unusual threads?" Ellen blinked. "Unusual? Silk from the East. Or perhaps something rarer." His voice dropped conspiratorially. "I have need of a particular material for my work. A cloth spun from the webs of certain spiders, said to be strongest when woven under a new moon." Ellen's mouth opened, then closed. I don't think—" "No matter," Leechwood interrupted cheerfully. "The salve is yours regardless. But should you ever come across such a cloth, do think of me." Ellen clutched the pot to her chest and stood hastily. "Thank you, Doctor." Of course, of course." He ushered her toward the door, then added, as if it were an afterthought, "Apply the salve sparingly, and do let me know if you start hearing the spiders." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Leechwood turned back to his workshop, humming that same tuneless melody as he reached for a fresh vial. The salve, as he had neglected to mention, contained a few extra ingredients, just a whisper of nightshade, a hint of something he'd scraped from a moonlit mushroom. Nothing harmful, at least not immediately. Outside, the first stars were beginning to prick through the evening sky. Somewhere in the village, Lord Alaric lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his hunting lodge. And in a small cottage at the edge of town, a widow unscrewed a clay pot, unaware that her sleepless nights were only just beginning. Chapter 14. The moral of the story. Lord Alaric eventually returned to his castle, though he took the long way, a winding path through the woods where the trees grew thick enough to block out the sun. He slept fitfully in his own bed, haunted less by plague doctors now than by the lingering suspicion that his humors were still unbalanced, still plotting against him. He never did pay Leechwood's invoice. The surgeon, for his part, did not seem particularly bothered by this. Business was booming. The widow Ellen had returned after 3 nights of the salve, babbling about spiders knitting tapestries in her walls. The blacksmith's cousin arrived next, then the miller's son, then a traveling minstrel who swore his lute strings were whispering to him at night. Each was given a unique remedy, a tincture, a poultice, a carefully curated horror, and each left with lighter pockets and heavier eyelids. Time passed. In the modern age, we like to think we've moved beyond such barbaric remedies. No leeches cling to our temples, unless you count certain spa treatments. No surgeons stir cauldrons of fermented stag antler, unless you visited particularly ambitious craft breweries. Our sleeping pills come neatly packaged, with typed lists of side effects and child-proof caps. And yet, the warnings on those little bottles are not so different from Leechwood's cheerful diagnoses. May cause dizziness, vivid dreams, sleepwalking, temporary paralysis. A far cry from the figs will speak to you, but not entirely unrelated. We still chase sleep like a thief in the night, bargaining with chemistry instead of humors. We still wake groggy and disoriented, our mouths tasting of copper and regret. The methods have changed, but the desperation remains. As for Lord Alaric, he never slept well again. But he did learn a valuable lesson. The only thing worse than counting sheep is counting the minutes until dawn, knowing your surgeon's invoice is still unpaid, and that he has your signet ring as collateral. And so, dear listener, the next time you lie awake, staring at the ceiling, remember, it could be worse. You could be hearing the figs laugh. E hentu.